Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into medieval Europe,
Okay.
specifically that fascinating system we call feudalism. Get ready for some aha moments because this era is full of surprises.
It really is. When you think about it, feudalism wasn't some granding plan, cooked up by a king or council. It evolved organically, almost like a plant, finding its way through cracks in the pavement.
Okay, so picture this. The Roman Empire has crumbled, leaving Europe in chaos.
Right.
There's no central authority, no real law and order.
Mm,
It's a dangerous time.
yeah.
So what do people do? They turn to whoever seems strong and capable of protecting them.
Exactly. Powerful lords step in to fill the void. They offer protection to those who are weaker, but that protection comes at a price. They demand loyalty and military service in exchange for land.
So that's where the concept of fiefs comes in.
Yeah,
It's not just a free handout of land, it's a strategic transaction.
precisely. These fiefs, or land grants, created a web of obligations that stretched from the king at the very top down through nobles' knights and all the way to the peasants working the land. Think of it like a pyramid, with each level dependent on the one above it.
And each level providing something in return, right?
Yes.
Like a complex network of IOUs. So tell me about life as a peasant. Was it as grueling as we often imagine?
Well, it certainly wasn't easy. Peasants were tied to the land, meaning they couldn't just pack up and move to a different village if things got tough. They farmed the land, paying taxes to their lord in the form of crops and labor. It was a hard life.
Right.
But it's important to remember that these peasants weren't just passive figures. They were skilled farmers, artisans, and builders.
And they were resourceful, too.
Yes.
I remember reading that their diet was largely vegetarian, not by choice, but because meat was a luxury they could rarely afford.
That's right. As forests dwindled, access to wild game became more limited, so bread and vegetables became the staples of their diet. They learned to make the most of what they had. And they even developed some pretty ingenious farming techniques.
Like what? What kind of technology did they have back then? I always picture them toiling away with primitive tools.
You might be surprised by their ingenuity. The heavy plow with a special mold board, for example, was a game changer. It allowed them to till the soil more efficiently,
Huh.
leading to increased crop yields.
So this seemingly simple tool had a ripple effect on their entire society. More food, potentially a larger population, even greater stability. It makes you think about how interconnected things are.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's not all. They also invented the horse collar,
Okay.
which revolutionized transportation and agriculture. It allowed horses to pull heavier loads without choking, making them far more effective work animals.
So these medieval folks were a lot more innovative than we often give them credit for. But we can't forget about the rise of towns and cities. How did those bustling centers of trade and commerce fit into this feudal system?
That's where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah.
As towns grew, they attracted merchants and artisans, people with valuable skills, but who weren't necessarily bound to the land like peasants. These skilled workers formed guilds
Okay.
to protect their interests and regulate trade, creating a new kind of power structure within the feudal system.
So they were essentially creating their own little mini societies
Right.
within the larger feudal framework. That must have led to some tension.
Absolutely. These guilds became incredibly powerful, often challenging the authority of feudal lords. They wanted more freedom, more autonomy, and they weren't afraid to fight for it. And that's how we start to see the rise of communes, independent city-states that often clashed with the established feudal order.
Okay, so we've got these towns, growing guilds, gaining power, and cracks starting to appear in the once solid structure of feudalism. What happens next?
Well, you can't have all this trade and commerce without money changing hands, right?
Right.
So let's talk about the evolution of finance during this period.
Perfect. Because it's not all knights and castles, is it? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how money started flowing through medieval Europe.
All right, so as trade expanded,
Okay.
the need for reliable currency became crucial. That's where coins like the Genoan grosso and the Florentine florin come into play. These gold and silver coins were standardized and reliable,
Okay.
making international trade much smoother.
It's like they were laying the groundwork for a modern currency system.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating detail. Credit was already a thing. Merchants utilized letters of exchange,
Wow.
which were essentially early versions of checks. It shows just how sophisticated their financial systems were becoming.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. They were using credit centuries ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got money flowing, trade booming, cities growing. What about education? Was learning confined to monasteries, or were there other centers of knowledge?
The demand for educated merchants, lawyers, and administrators led to the establishment of universities. Bologna, Paris, Salerno, these became the intellectual hotbeds of Europe, attracting students from all corners of the continent.
So like a medieval version of study abroad programs. Were they all speaking Latin, or were there language barriers to contend with?
Latin was the common language which helped facilitate this international exchange of knowledge and ideas. It's fascinating how they created this vibrant intellectual community centuries before the internet or even the printing press.
It really makes you appreciate the power of human connection, even in a time when travel was slow and arduous. But while all this was happening in Europe, there were other empires and innovations happening elsewhere in the world.
You're right. While Europe was grappling with feudalism,
Yeah.
the largest empire the world had ever seen was emerging in the East. The Mongol Empire, led by the legendary Genghis Khan, stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe.
Okay, hold on. We need to unpack this. We're talking about Genghis Khan, the fearsome warrior who united the Mongol tribes and conquered vast swaths of territory.
That's the one. His grandson, Kublai Khan, even ruled China and established a new capital, Khanbalik, which later became Beijing. It was a magnificent city described in detail by Marco Polo,
Oh, wow.
who traveled there in the late 13th century.
Marco Polo's travels are the stuff of legend. But it wasn't just military might that made the Mongols and the Chinese so influential, right?
Right.
They were also incredibly innovative.
Absolutely. The Chinese were centuries ahead of Europe in many ways. They invented gunpowder paper, printing the compass, and even paper money.
Really?
Imagine Marco Polo's shock when he saw people using paper as currency.
It's like he stepped into the future. But Europe wasn't just sitting idly by while the East was making these leaps forward.
No.
This was also the age of exploration, right?
Exactly. Driven by the desire for spices and new trade routes, European explorers began venturing further and further afield.
And that's where Christopher Columbus enters the picture.
Right.
His quest to find a westward route to Asia led to a rather unexpected discovery.
You could say that he stumbled upon the Americas.
Wow.
A whole new continent that Europeans had no prior knowledge of. Talk about a detour that changed the course of history.
I can only imagine the shock and wonder when they realized they had landed on something completely unknown.
It's hard to overstate the impact of that encounter.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate the impact of that encounter.
It truly was a monumental event. The Columbian Exchange, as it's known, introduced new foods, plants, and animals to both Europe and the Americas. Imagine Europe without potatoes, tomatoes, corn, or even chocolate. None of those existed there before.
Okay, you've got me hooked. Let's talk more about this Columbian Exchange and its impact on both sides of the Atlantic. But before we dive into that, I think we need to take a breath and really appreciate the scope of what we've just covered.
I agree.
From the intricacies of feudalism in Europe to the vast Mongol Empire and the mind-blowing innovations of China, and then that world-altering encounter between Europe and the Americas, we've covered a lot of ground.
It's incredible how interconnected the world was even back then, isn't it? It's not just separate stories, it's all part of a larger tapestry of human history.
But I think we need to take a deeper dive into some of these events and really unpack their significance.
I'm all for it. Let's dig in and see what other hidden gems we can unearth. It's remarkable how those early explorers set out with a specific goal in mind, finding a new route to the spice markets of the East, and ended up changing the world in ways they could never have imagined.
It's a classic example of how history is full of unintended consequences, right? But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's circle back to feudalism for a bit. We've talked about its structure, but I'm curious about the human side of things. What was it like to actually live under that system?
Well, imagine a world where your entire life is dictated by your place in this rigid hierarchy. For the vast majority of people, the peasants' life revolved around the land. They worked tirelessly to produce food for themselves and their lords, often living in small villages clustered around the lord's manor or a nearby monastery.
It's a far cry from our modern world of instant communication and global travel, isn't it? I imagine their world felt very small and limited.
Absolutely. Travel was difficult and dangerous, communication was slow, and most people never ventured far from their place of birth. But despite the hardships, they found ways to create community, celebrate, and make meaning out of their lives.
We talked about their largely vegetarian diet, but what about other aspects of their daily lives? Did they have any time for leisure or entertainment?
Believe it or not, they did. Village festival and religious holidays offered opportunities for socializing, dancing, singing, and storytelling. These celebrations were a vital part of their lives, providing a much-needed break from the daily grind.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom. They knew how to have a good time. But what about those iconic figures of the Middle Ages, the knights? Were they really as glamorous and chivalrous as they're often portrayed in movies and books?
The image of the knight in shining armor, rescuing damsels in distress and fighting for honor and glory is a romantic notion. But the reality was much more complex. Knights were professional warriors trained from a young age to fight and defend their lord's interests.
So they were essentially the elite soldiers of their time, the medieval equivalent of special forces.
You could say that. They were highly skilled in combat, both on horseback and on foot, and their loyalty to their lord was paramount. They were often rewarded for their service with land grants, further cementing their place within the feudal hierarchy.
And what about those castles we always associate with knights and the Middle Ages? Were they purely defensive stud kids, or did they serve other purposes?
Castles were certainly built for defense, designed to withstand attacks and sieges, but they were also symbols of power and status, the center of the lord's domain. They housed not only the lord and his family, but also his retainers, servants, and sometimes even villagers seeking protection.
So they were like fortified mini-cities with everything from kitchens and workshops to chapels and great halls for feasting and entertainment.
Exactly. They were bustling centers of activity, playing a crucial role in the social and economic life of the region. But let's zoom out a bit and consider how this feudal system, which seemed so entrenched, eventually began to unravel.
That's what I'm really curious about. What were the forces that led to its decline?
Well, as towns grew and trade expanded, the power of feudal lords began to wane. The rise of a merchant class with its own wealth and influence challenged the traditional land-based economy of feudalism.
So it was like a shift in the balance of power, with money and commerce becoming increasingly important.
Precisely. Kings also started to centralize their power, building standing armies that were more reliable than feudal levies. They began to assert their authority over the nobility, gradually chipping away at the foundations of the feudal system.
And what about those other major events we touched on earlier, like the Crusades and the Black Death? Did they play a role in feudalism's decline?
Absolutely. The Crusades, while motivated by religious zeal, also exposed Europeans to new ideas, cultures, and trade goods from the East. This broadened their horizons and weakened the hold of traditional feudal values.
It's like those journeys to the Holy Land inadvertently planted the seeds of change within European society.
You could say that. And then there was the Black Death, that devastating pandemic that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, killing millions of people.
That must have been a truly terrifying time. It's hard to even imagine the scale of suffering.
It was a cataclysmic event that had profound consequences for Europe. The massive loss of life led to labor shortages, which gave peasants more bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. This further disrupted the traditional feudal relationships, which were based on obligation and servitude.
So in a way, the Black Death, as horrific as it was, contributed to the breakdown of the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism.
It's a complex and tragic irony, isn't it? But it's a reminder that even the most seemingly stable systems can be overturned by unforeseen events. The Black Death was a turning point, marking the beginning of the end for feudalism in Europe.
It's fascinating how these seemingly disparate events, the Crusades, the Black Death, the rise of towns and trade, all converged to reshape European society.
And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's not just a linear progression of events. It's a complex web of interconnected forces, ideas, and individuals all shaping the course of human civilization.
It's mind-blowing how something as devastating as the Black Death could become a catalyst for such profound social and economic change. Talk about history's unexpected twists and turns.
It really highlights how seemingly unshakable systems can be fundamentally altered by events beyond anyone's control. But amidst those upheavals,
Right.
we also see incredible resilience and adaptation. People found ways to rebuild, innovate, and create new systems that better suited their changing world.
And speaking of innovation, I want to circle back to something we touched upon earlier, the role of those medieval merchants and artisans in reshaping Europe. They weren't just cogs in the feudal machine, they were driving forces of change, right?
Absolutely. As trade routes expanded and cities grew, these skilled individuals organized into powerful guilds began to exert their own influence. They became a force to be reckoned with, challenging the dominance of the traditional land-earning nobility.
We talked about guilds earlier, but I'm still a bit fuzzy on how they actually functioned. Were they like early versions of labor unions or professional organizations?
That's a great analogy. Guilds set standards for craftsmanship, regulated trade, and provided support and training for their members.
Okay.
They were essentially self-governing bodies that wielded considerable economic and political power.
So they weren't just about making a profit, they also play a role in shaping the social and political landscape of their cities.
Exactly. Guilds fostered a sense of community and pride among their members.
Hmm.
And they often contributed to civic projects like building hospital schools and even those magnificent cathedrals that still stand today.
It's like they were weaving together the economic, social, and even spiritual fabric of their communities. And as trade routes connected Europe to the wider world, those merchants and artisans became conduits for new ideas and cultural influences.
Think about the Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes that spanned Asia and reached into Europe. It brought exotic goods like silk spices and porcelain from the East, creating new markets and stimulating demand for luxury items.
So these merchants weren't just traders, they were cultural ambassadors bringing new tastes, fashions, and even technologies to Europe.
It's fascinating how trade can have such a profound impact on a society, shaping everything from its economy to its cuisine and even its worldview.
Speaking of cuisine, I remember you mentioned how the European diet was primarily vegetarian during this period. Did the influx of new goods from the East change that?
Absolutely. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, which were once rare and expensive, became more readily available,
Yeah.
adding new dimensions of flavor to European cooking.
I can only imagine how exciting it must have been to experience those exotic flavors for the first time. It's like their taste buds were on a grand adventure.
And it wasn't just about taste.
Right.
Spices also had medicinal uses and were thought to have preservative properties. They became an integral part of European culture and commerce.
Okay, so we've journeyed from the rise and fall of feudalism through the emergence of powerful guilds and the expansion of trade to those groundbreaking innovations in China and that world-altering encounter between Europe and the Americas. It's been an incredible deep dive into a truly transformative era.
And we've only scratched the surface. The Middle Ages were a period of such complexity and dynamism, full of captivating stories, larger-than-life characters, and enduring legacies that continue to shape our world today.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a collection of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven from the lives, ideas, and actions of countless individuals, all striving to make sense of their world and leave their mark on the course of human events.
And the beauty of it is that there's always more to discover, more connections to make, and more perspectives to explore.
Well said. It's been a true pleasure exploring this fascinating era with you. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey through medieval Europe and beyond. We hope you've enjoyed the ride and left with a newfound appreciation for this remarkable period in history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those aha moments coming.